Thank you all so much. After that very generous introduction, thank you, Kristen. I feel like I don't even need to talk now. You've heard so much about me. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here. For those of you who have seen the exhibition, I hope you liked it. I hope you want to go back. I hope you want to bring all your friends. It's really wonderful to see people engaging with art here again after such a long cold spell, if I can put it that way. So I'm going to talk to you today about Sargent and painting and fashion. And let me just tell you right up front that I could give an hour lecture on any one of the objects in the exhibition, and I'm not going to do that. So if your favorite thing isn't included here, feel free to ask me a question about it after the lecture today, or come back for one of the other lectures in this series. We have a wonderful lineup of presenters that will speak about other aspects of Sargent's work, and I think you all have a handout outlining what those are and who our fabulous speakers will be. So I wanted to tell you why the lobby looks this way. We often have a video down there, as regular MFAers will know, but for this exhibition, I really wanted to give a sense of the theatrical, because a painting and a portrait are really performances. You engage, you engage with a director, in this case Sargent. You are dressed, you are posed, and importantly, your likeness goes on public view for people to talk about, to love, to hate, to query. And that aspect of portraiture is something that we don't always talk about, but it's particularly important in Sargent's work. Most of these paintings were exhibited either in Paris at the Salon or at the Royal Academy in London, or even here in Boston at the St. Botolph Club in Sargent's first exhibition. So thinking about the public response and the drama and the performative aspect of portraiture is something that I was very much thinking about when I conceived the exhibition, and I wanted that theatrical effect. Our new exhibition designer, Louisa Respondek, came up with this idea of doing a stage set look for the lobby, and I loved it because it also spoke to the role that cloth can play. And this way, everybody gets to see cloth in 3 dimensions to see what happens when it's draped and folded and the light hits it. So that idea of the theatrical is something that you should keep in mind over the course of my talk. Now, what about Sargent himself? Here are 3 images of him, a self-portrait at center from 1906, now in the collection of the Uffizi, and a slightly earlier one from 1892 at upper left, and a photograph of him here in Boston in 1924, the year before he died. You can see a sort of consistency in his outfit. He was not at all fashionable himself. He looked and was described many times like a banker. He wore 3-piece suits. He was distinguished, but not taking on any part of the idea of the artiste, which was very popular in the late 19th century, as you can see here in images by Sargent on the left of his teacher, the French portraitist Carolus Duran, who is shown as a flaneur of the boulevards. William Merritt Chase's portrait of Whistler from 1885, which shows Whistler as the ultimate aesthete with his walking stick. Or William Merritt Chase on the right by the portraitist Beckwith, showing him in very fashionable spats. We have to remember that this idea of being an artist also had its own costuming, in which Sargent did not participate. He even wore a suit and tie while he was painting. This is Sargent painting Mrs. Fiske Warren in the Gardner museum's Gothic room, which we'll be talking about in a minute. But just because Sargent didn't dress fabulously himself, he was very interested in fashion, and this was a fashionable age. This is made partly possible by developments in industry during the late 19th century, one of which was the proliferation of illustrated journals and the speed with which they were made and sent back and forth across the Atlantic. I'm showing you a French one at upper left, La Mode Illustrée, Harper's Bazaar in the center, and a sheet from Godey's Ladies' Book on the right. Color printing and the dissemination of ideas about fashion happened very quickly during this period. You also see the development of, frankly, new colors for fashion during the late 19th century, and this has to do with industrialization as well. The advances that were made in the chemical dye industry in the mid and late 19th century brought forth a great variety of new colors. In times before that, the dye industry was limited to what could be made from natural materials, the colors of the earth, the colors that could be gleaned from plants and other materials that were in the natural world. But chemists got to work, sometimes on purpose and sometimes by accident. If you ever read the wonderful book about the invention of mauve, the great purple color that you see in the lady on the left, that created new, bright colors that became immediately popular in fashion. And those dyes were also used to make new colors for artists, new paints, new pigments. Chrome yellow, for example. And the great revolution in color that you see in late 19th century painting is largely a product of the new chemical industry. The other thing we see is the rise of couture houses as we now know them. In former years, you might have had a personal seamstress who you would work with one-on-one to create a design based on maybe somebody else's dress that you had seen at a fancy party or on descriptions in contemporary periodicals. In the mid-19th century, we start to see things like the House of Worth, and I'm showing you here one of their labels at center, a Worth gown at the left, a picture of Charles Worth, who I hope you can see from his velvet beret and his big tie, that he did consider himself an artiste and said that fashion design was important as painting. Worth was only one of several different houses that established themselves in Paris, but it was one of the biggest and most popular, with, at one point, 1,000 employees. Women of a certain class came from around the world to have their dresses designed by Worth. They might buy a whole season of dresses, and they might come back year after year. It was something that was expensive. Sargent's portraits were expensive too, but you usually only bought one of them of yourself, as opposed to a whole season of dresses. And that idea of fashion enters into popular culture as well. You can see on the right a cartoon of two extremely fashionably dressed ladies examining works at an art exhibition, which was popular in the fashion world not only for the women who came to see it, but also for the fashions that were portrayed in the paintings on the walls. And you can see one, the caption reads, I can tell that's a Worth dress. So the fashionability of fashion is really the moment that we're in. And for women, it was really important to navigate the right clothes for the right occasion, at the right time of day, for the right sort of event. Think about what you wore this morning. Think about how you dressed up for Halloween yesterday. These are very conscious decisions, And as Edith Wharton, who of course was from the upper class and participated in all of this herself, as Wharton noted in her novel, The Age of Innocence, she has the husband, Newland Archer, reflecting on his wife's wardrobe. Wharton wrote, Archer was struck again by the religious reverence of even the most unworldly American women for the social advantages of dress. It's their armor, he thought, their defense against the unknown and their defiance of it. I love that idea about dress as social armor, which of course gives confidence when you step into an event, whether you've chosen to fit in, to dress down, or to dress up. And these clothes meant a lot to people, and not only because they were costly. Dresses were often saved, they were sometimes reworked for another wearer, and I'm showing you here on the screen Sargent's portrait of Sarah Choate Sears, which belongs to the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and 2 of the 3 dresses we have in the exhibition that come from a collection of Sarah Sears's gowns that were given to the MFA in the 1950s, saved over time. The dress on the right is from 1877, the green one at center from the 1890s, saved until the 1950s and given to the Museum of Fine Arts. How many of you have saved your wedding dress? How many of you have saved your favorite t-shirt from that Tina Turner concert you went to? How many save baby clothes? These clothes have great sentimental associations, and they mean a lot, not only for themselves, but for the people who wore them. And we see that very viscerally in this painting in the exhibition. Mrs. Hamersley, Mrs. Hugh Hamersley from 1892, on loan from the Metropolitan Museum, who appears here in an unusual color, a sort of cerise or fuchsia garment made out of velvet with a silver lace collar that looks like it came right out of a painting by Rubens. Next to it, on display, also in the Met's collection, is a swatch of that dress. And with it, on black-bordered mourning paper, is a note from her sister, Mrs. Hamersley's sister, saying, "This is a swatch of the dress that my beloved late sister wore when she sat to Sargent." The fact that these things have remained together tells you how much these sentimental associations mean even after the dress goes out of the family. They've always stayed together. What that means in terms of Mrs. Hamersley is it allowed the scientists at the Met to examine both the fabric and the pigment that Sargent used in the painting and discovered that they both contained some of these new pigments and dyes. So here we have a picture that both looks backward in its adoption of a Rubens collar in the fashion and also looks forward in its very materials, to say nothing of the way Mrs. Hamersley looks like she's going to pop out of that chair at a moment's notice. It's a very modern way of making a portrait. So what does it mean, though, when the clothes mean so much and the artist says, "Nah, I want you to wear something else. I know you really wanted to wear one of the favorite gowns that you just showed me, but no, I want you to wear something else." And that's what happened with Mrs. Fisk Warren, who you see here, the beautiful portrait from 1903 in the MFA's collection. As I said, it was painted in the Gothic room at Fenway Court, where Sargent set up a temporary studio during his Boston visit in 1903. And you see another photograph of Sargent's session of painting Mrs. Fisk Warren here at center, a view of the Gothic room at upper right, and a view of the Gothic room a couple of years ago when we actually lent Mrs. Fisk Warren to be displayed in her original surroundings. So Mrs. Fisk Warren wanted to wear a green dress. And Sargent said, "No, I don't see the painting this way. He was, no doubt, responding to the color scheme of the Gothic room with its brown walls and mahogany furniture, deep red upholstery linked by gilding, gilded sculpture, gilded candelabra, gilded aspects of the furniture. Mrs. Fiske-Warren had golden hair, and Sargent was seeing something that was a symphony of reds and pinks. So he made her borrow a gown from her sister-in-law, which didn't fit. And Rachel, based on both the painting and the photographs that we have of the sittings, doesn't seem to be wearing a dress at all. It looks like a piece of pink fabric wrapped around her that Sargent imagined into a dress. He was seeing something very different than a likeness. He was seeing a painting that was compositionally complementary with all these golds and pinks and reds, a painting that would last through time. And his approach was validated by a critic when they wrote in the review, when this was exhibited in 1903, that this was an heirloom to pass down. Apparently, Mrs. Fiske-Warren never loved it, probably because she wanted to wear her green dress. And it did stay in the family until Rachel gave it to us in the 1960s. Well, how does it feel when Sargent, what are we doing here? There we go. How does it feel when Sargent takes the dress you said you wanted to wear and he changes it? So this is Louise Pomeroy Inches, painted in 1887, also in the MFA's collection, along with the much altered but original dress that she wears in this portrait. So you can see that Sargent's likeness, or non-likeness, if I can put it that way, has only one bow, and the dress has two. It was symmetrical. Sargent, let me be upfront, the bodice has been replaced for this gown. It was altered later for another woman to wear it, somebody who was a little bit taller than Louise Inches, but the original bodice remains in our collection, and we know from its fashioning that it too had two bows. So Sargent makes something symmetrical, asymmetrical. What did Louise feel about the way that was changed? Or here, what happens when Sargent takes what you're wearing and pulls and tucks and pins and drapes it in a way that it didn't actually appear when you were making the portrait? So here is Lady Sassoon on the right, Aline Rothschild Sassoon. Her marriage from the Rothschilds to the Sassoons brought together two of Europe's greatest banking families. She's wearing an opera cloak, which was typically dark in color, often black, and usually with a bright silk lining. You can see from the way it looks on the mannequin that it hangs straight down, and you only get little glimpses of the pink in the openings of the sleeves and in the gaps in the opening down the front of the garment. It would have given you a shimmer of pink as you threw it off once you got to where you were going, but when you were wearing it, it was not the way Sargent portrays it. So what does he do? Well, first of all, he loves painting black on black. It's his most favorite thing. And he gives this silk taffeta an amazing three-dimensional presence. Painting black on black or any monochromatic thing is hard, and Sargent loved setting himself those artistic challenges. So he's very interested in making this silk taffeta catch the light so that he can render three-dimensional form. He takes that cloak and he opens it up and he pulls it across Aline's body and he turns the lapel around so that you get this great swoop of pink that links together her face and her hands. So he is always, always thinking about what the final painting is going to look like and not necessarily the way the garment actually was worn. So who is Sargent anyway, that he took all of these liberties? Let me just give you a bit of background. Those of you who have seen the show will know that it's not organized chronologically. This is not a march through Sargent's career, but instead a thematic look at different ways that fashion was used in Sargent's work. You see him on the left as a boy. You see him as an aspiring Parisian student at the center in a oil sketch by the Italian artist Boldini, and on the right in a photograph that says "Bohemian as Sargent ever got." You can see he's still wearing a three-piece suit and a tie. So Sargent was born in Italy to American parents. He was educated sort of erratically, but he was well-read. He spoke German, French, Italian, and English. He was someone whose artistic talent as both a pianist and as a painter were noticed quite early. He actually thought about becoming a pianist at one point, but decided to follow the art career and had his first training at the Academy in Florence, which they quickly realized wasn't adequate to his talents. So like every other aspiring painter who was good in the late 19th century, he went to Paris, along with his family, settling there in 1874. When he got there, he undertook two paths simultaneously. He enrolled at the École des Beaux-Arts, which you see at the upper left, which followed an extremely traditional and quite mandated course of study. The first thing you learned how to do at the École was to draw after classical casts. And believe it or not, Sargent made this drawing of a dancing faun in maybe 1873, 1874. He's 18 years old. It's in the collection of the Harvard Art Museums. You can see how brilliantly accomplished he was even as a teenager. The program at the École was mandated by the French state. You learned how to draw from plaster casts before you were ever allowed to draw a human being. Then you had to master figure drawing before you were ever allowed to pick up a paintbrush. At the same time that Sargent was in that program, he also began to study with Carolus Duran, one of the most popular, stylish Parisian portraitists of the day. And I'm showing you a caricature of Carolus in the center there. He was said to dance back and forth from his canvas like a fencer, and that's how the cartoonist has shown him, and that's something that Sargent picked up as a student. He was said to leap forward, make a few brush strokes, and leap back again to see the finished effect. You see one of Carolus's most famous paintings, The Woman with the Glove from 1869 at lower right. Carolus had an entirely different perspective on how to learn how to be a painter. He advocated painting in what was called alla prima, or directly on canvas. Don't fuss around with a whole bunch of drawings. Don't draw it out on the canvas before you ever put the paintbrush on. Just go for it. And we see the combination of both tradition and reverence for the past and a very modern way of thinking in Sargent's work throughout his career. In other words, he loves painting black on black, as I expressed. It's hard, but part of his love of doing that comes from his admiration of the work of Frans Hals, whose image from 1645 of Susanna Bailey from the National Gallery of Scotland you see second from left, another master of combining black and white and of showing them given three-dimensional form. Or later in the 1890s with his Sargent's view of Lady Agnew at far right, whose sensuous half-length figure is very much made in reverence to the great 18th century portraits by artists like Raeburn, whose Jacobina Copeland you see just to the left of Lady Agnew. At the same time, you would never, ever call Mrs. Davis or Lady Agnew copies of the old masters. They are distinctly modern in every way, in their vitality, in their engagement, in their pose and in their loose brushwork. So it's easy to see how modern Sargent was in comparison to other portraitists of his own age. So Sargent at the upper left and upper right, Edouard Pailleron from 1879 at the upper left, and Madame Subercaseaux at the upper right from 1880. Somebody's phone is ringing, sorry. If you don't mind silencing your phone, I'd be grateful. You can see how different Sargent's paintings look compared to the work of, for example, Léon Bonnat, a very famous French portraitist who shows William Walters, the founder of the Walters Art Gallery, in 1883, in other words, 4 years after Sargent. At the bottom left, you see the man in the dark frock coat standing before a plain background. See how different he looks from Pailleron at upper left. Or Carolus himself, painting now Caroline Astor in 1890 in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. Staged, but not lively, like Madame Subercaseaux at upper right. So let's look a little harder at Edouard Pailleron, 1879, in the exhibition now in the collection of the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. Pailleron was one of Sargent's earliest patrons in Paris. He was a playwright. He was known for his satiric comedies about Parisian society, often featuring the politics of the drawing room. And here is Pailleron's drawing room in two photographs that showed up at a flea market in Paris. And we figured out who they were because this is Sargent's portrait of Pailleron's children, which is now in the collection of the museum in Des Moines. This is Sargent's portrait reflected in the mirror of Pailleron's wife, now in the collection of the National Gallery. And here is Pailleron himself reflected in another mirror in this amazing horror vacui hodgepodge of stuff that the Sargents just sort of leap out of this clutter in an amazing way. So Pailleron has what I might call a careless elegance, or maybe a careful sloppiness. He's slouching. He's got one hand on his hip. He's wearing a drawstring shirt with red trim at the neck and at the cuffs. His daughter, Marie-Louise, described her father's jacket as a veston de travail, a workman's jacket, unstructured, informal, and, as she put it, a little bit scruffy. And I'm just comparing it for you here at the lower right with an image of those French workmen's jackets that you can still see in France and which have become quite stylish and which you can order online. So he's wearing that workman's jacket with an unconventional shirt with that tasseled drawstring collar. And maybe it doesn't come as a surprise to see Pailleron dressed so casually, because after all, he owned a portrait of himself by the French artist Jean-Adolphe Bosset, showing himself on horseback wearing a burnous. It could be this painting, which appeared in 1995 on the auction market, a painting by Bosset of a man on horseback wearing a burnous, and it's inscribed, "À mon ami Edouard." So what Sargent captures here is a distinct type, a sort of character from the Parisian stage of the city, the bohemian. And I'm showing you here on the right a little drawing by an American artist, Alfred Miller, of a bohemian artist holding his mahl stick and his portfolio, striding through the streets of Paris. It's labeled Paris Bohemian. Sargent gives Pailleron that identity by not dressing him up in a three-piece suit. Well, that seems relatively conventional even when I show you the next portrait of a man that I want to talk about, Dr. Pozzi at Home from 1881 in the collection of the Hammer Museum. So Sargent using fashion here to quite a different effect in his portrait of another Parisian man about town, Samuel Pozzi. Pozzi had been described by the writer Robert de Montesquieu as charming and seductive. A fellow physician would call Dr. Pozzi a beautiful work of art. So this is Sargent's most unconventional portrait of a man. We know what Pozzi looked like. Here are two photographs of him. He dressed carefully but very professionally. He was well-groomed, elegantly garbed in tailored suits. He was, after all, a leading member of the Faculty of Medicine at the University in Paris. He was a distinguished, gynecologist, some of whose ideas are still used today. So why doesn't he show Pozzi as the distinguished man of intellect, sitting in his office in front of a wall of books, like I did during Zoom the entire time? No matter if I had my PJs on, I was always in front of a wall of books, right? But Sargent showed Pozzi in a very, very different way. It's interesting to me that this painting, 18th century portrait by David of a man named Alphonse Leroy, is shown as a distinguished physician in his office with books and some of his experimental equipment. Leroy was also a physician of gynecology, which was Pozzi's specialty, and David's portrait was described in an 1880 monograph on David, and he too wears a red robe open to show a white cravat at his neck. Red is, after all, the color of the Faculty of Medicine at the University in Paris. But it seems pretty obvious that Sargent responded personally to Pozzi's physical charisma, the attractive physician, himself keen to embrace the extraordinary. He would have been irresistible to Sargent, a man who was often drawn to striking and bizarre things, to male beauty, and to the idea of a theater. And this portrait is theatrical indeed. Great care must have been taken in selecting that red dressing gown in which he's posed, the manner in which his ruffled cuffs peek out from his sleeve to call attention to his graceful, sensual hands, and the lush setting of red on red. Here we see a conflation of public and private, and I would remind you that the original title for this painting is Dr. Pozzi at Home. So he simultaneously seems to stand guard at the entrance to his private quarters and to take his bow on a curtained stage, that draped red backdrop, clearly reminiscent of theatrical curtains. Again, we see an homage to the art of the past while simultaneously exploring a very modern man indeed. And Amalia Subercaseaux, who we see here. Amalia was the daughter of a very wealthy and Eurocentric Chilean family, and she married Ramon Subercaseaux, who was a Chilean diplomat posted to Paris and also an aspiring painter who became a friend of Sargent's. Amalia recalled that Sargent came to their apartment and they let him choose everything, the setting, the clothing, and all the details. He was entirely free, Amalia recalled, to arrange the composition of the portrait as he wished. So Sargent presents Amalia as a woman at the height of fashion, and he stages the sittings in a room that's furnished in a modern aesthetic movement style with its jardiniere, the lilies, the black and white color scheme, echoed by her dress, a smart white afternoon dress with a long button bodice and a flounced skirt that's trimmed with black velvet, ribbon, and lace, which Sargent carefully twists and pulls around her so that he can give this incredible cascade of black and white down half of the surface of the painting. Well, Amalia seems like a perfect Parisienne, but to a French audience, she was not really a Parisienne. Sargent won a medal for his portrait of Amalia, but the prize was immediately transferred to his other submission, the double portrait of Edouard Pailleron's children, which you now see at lower right. The change came, according to Subercaseaux, at the instigation of an irate Edouard Pailleron, you see it upper right, who felt that this foreign-born Parisienne, which Subercaseaux quotes Pailleron saying that she was, and I quote, a stranger and an unknown, that a stranger and an unknown certainly couldn't be honored over the portrait of his children. And eventually the medals were bestowed on both of Sargent's paintings, but the nationalist view of the impossibility of a Parisienne étrangère remained. So in June 1881, a month after the Salon opened, a writer for the French magazine L'Illustration wrote, totally annoyed that an American horse had just won the Grand Prix at Longchamp for the first time, wrote in an article, remember, 1881, and I quote, "I know since the victory of Foxhall, one determined French patriot who can no longer, without a lot of grumbling, say the name America. He finds the Yankees a bit unbecoming. They have painters who carry off our medals, like Mr. Sargent, beautiful women who eclipse ours, like Madame Gautreau, and horses that beat our steeds. It is a peaceful war, but they come to hoist their victory colors over our land." Now, this is 1881. It's context for you to think about Sargent's most famous portrait from 1883. Madame Gautreau here on the left, and in one of the many sketches and studies that Sargent made of her, since she was, as he put it, sort of an uncooperative sitter, couldn't stay still for very long. Virginie Gautreau was an American from New Orleans. She moved to Paris with her mother after her father died during the Civil War fighting for the Confederacy. She married a Parisian banker, and she became what was called a sort of professional beauty, a celebrated and self-conscious belle who used her beauty and self-fashioning and quite a few cosmetics to enhance both of those things to acquire social position. She was deeply admired. The American painter Edward Simmons, who was then a student in Paris, described her, and I quote, "She was black as spades and white as milk. Something about her gave you the impression of infinite proportion, infinite grace, and infinite balance. Every artist wanted to depict her in marble or in paint." Well, Sargent represented Madame Gautreau eventually in 1883 as she wanted to be seen as a quintessential Parisienne, sophisticated, elegant, perfectly groomed, elegantly dressed, urban, independent. He was very careful in this pose. He turns her in a way so that you can't see any of the decoration that might have been on the back of her dress. We don't know who the designer of the dress was, and it doesn't survive. Some have suggested that it's Maison Félix, one of Worth's competitors, which was known as a house for its slim, chic, what we might even call a sheath dress. Madame Gautreau loved this painting. We know it because she wrote as much in the letter that you see on the right, which is in the Sargent archive here at the MFA, She called it and wrote to a friend, "Sargent has made a masterpiece of my painting." She didn't love it quite so much after it went to the Salon in May 1884. And I'm showing you here the painting and how it appeared at the Salon. You can see that one strap was down. Well, when this went on view, critics likely could not wait to say to Madame Gautreau's portrait what they would never say out in public to her. Sargent's friend Vernon Lee described the painting as, and I quote, "surrounded by shoals of astonished and jibing women." Many people professed to be shocked. Hard to believe that even with one strap down, this would be that shocking to an audience in Paris at the Salon, where there were plenty of nudes and plenty of risque portraits. But for one critic, let me just read you one of the many, many rude remarks about this painting. Of all the ladies in undress, the only one of interest is Sargent's. Interesting for its attention to the fine profile, reminiscent of Piero della Francesca. Interesting for its décolletage and its chains of silver, which are indecent and give the impression that they are about to fall down. Interesting for the powder that makes her skin cadaverous and clownish at the same time. Well, they also said something about Sargent. How could Sargent, they asked, paint a woman who had already painted herself? Really mean. And I'm pointing all this out to you, not particularly to tell the Madame X story for the next time, and I know my colleague Stephanie Herdrick will talk about that when she comes to speak on November 29th, but to tell you that these paintings become avatars and get criticized as if they were a stage production. Madame Gautreau's mother came to Sargent's studio, said her daughter had been lost, begged him to repaint the strap. He refused over the course of the Salon exhibition because it was just not done to repaint anything while the show was up. And while Madame Gautreau did retreat for a time from society, in about 8 years, she had recovered enough to have a French artist paint her. This is Gustave Courtois, who also painted her in profile with one strap down. Sargent did repaint the strap. You can see this in this photograph of Sargent in Paris, and at an early date, the strap has already been repainted. And he eventually recovered, obviously, or we wouldn't have a show, but it took him a while, and he was taken quite off guard. He kept the painting until 1915, when, after Madame Gautreau's death, he sold it to the Met. He said it was the best thing he had ever done. He regained his momentum through Americans, actually, both in Britain and in the United States. He painted in London Edith Russell, who you see up the upper left. We know her as Lady Playfair. She was painted in 1884, so the same year as the Salon exhibition, but she grew up as Edith Russell on Beacon Street. She married a British scientist and politician. The woman in the striped bodice at lower left was a New Yorker, the daughter of an American banker and railroad man who married into the British mercantile gentry, a family who invested in railroads and, I love this, in the importation of bananas. But then Sargent got a call from a wealthy New York banker, Henry Marquand, to paint his wife, Elizabeth, who you see here at the center. And Sargent named a really large price, thinking he didn't know whether he wanted to cross the Atlantic. And Marquand said yes. And Sargent made his first working trip, and only the second time he'd ever been in the United States, in November 1887, working in Newport, Boston, and New York, and earning lifelong contacts and friendships, including making the portrait of Mrs. Boyd and Mrs. Inches, which you see on the right. But the only person who, among Boston clients of Sargent's in the 1880s, the only one who wanted something spectacularly out of the ordinary was Isabella Stewart Gardner, whose portrait you see at the right, and who I hope you will go see in a wonderful new exhibition at the Gardner called Inventing Isabella. Isabella was 47 when she sat for Sargent. This one was one of 24 portraits that Sargent made between November 1887 and May 1888. They knew each other already. Their mutual friend was Henry James, who you see at center top. And Gardner convinced Henry James to arrange a meeting in London to take her to Sargent's studio in October 1886 because she was desperate to see Madame X. And in consequence, she asked for something similarly dramatic. They worked together on Sargent's portrait, making something iconic and distinctive with those pearls wrapped around her waist and the fabric carefully modeled to give her a halo. In fact, Henry James called this painting a Byzantine Madonna with a halo, and there's no doubt that Mrs. Gardner embraced that iconography of power with this severe frontal pose, the pearls festooned, the nimbus of the fabric radiating from her head, really do turn her into an item of worship. So think about this painting and some of the other ones that were shown here, as I said, in his first solo exhibition at the St. Botolph in January 1888. That show, like the Salon, was also rife with commentary. Visitors to the show behaved, in the words of one observer, and I quote, like a conclave of ghouls at a banquet of human flesh, tearing and rendering the feast before them. They compared Sargent's paintings with the people that they knew. Susan Hale wrote, "Between those who thought them too beautiful and those who thought them not beautiful enough, all just speculation of method and execution was lost. It might have been a Jarley's Waxworks or Madame Tussaud's exhibition. Others, in private, were a little less discreet." "I think Mrs. Inches looks as though she would bring you the head of Holofernes for the asking," wrote Fanny Lang to Isabella Stewart Gardner, while telling Mrs. Gardner that she thought her portrait by Sargent was superb. Well, like Madame X, Gardner's portrait became an avatar for the local audience to challenge her entitlement. The black gown that she's wearing is much less revealing than Louise Inches's red velvet evening dress, and these were painted at exactly the same time. But it was Gardner's dress that generated punning and criticism when the portrait was shown, comments that alluded specifically to rumors of a romantic affair, rumors that Mrs. Gardner had an attachment to the writer Frances Marion Crawford, and certain Bostonians remarked that Sargent had depicted Gardner all the way down to Crawford's notch. I think people are mean now. And others also came out against this portrait. "Mr. Sargent has had a profitable winter," said the Boston critic for the Art Amateur. And I continue, "What does it matter if Mr. Sargent, who, above all his contemporaries perhaps, has the gift of imparting distinction to his subject, makes a dowdy look like a queen, or to a little insignificant woman gives the air of a goddess, if no one can recognize in the picture the features of the original?" Sargent took it all in stride. He wrote to Mrs. Gardner, "The newspapers do not disturb me. Do you bear up?" Well, the Gardners kept this painting in their private quarters, visible only by invitation, although you could kind of get a glimpse of it after 1903, until Isabella's death in 1924, when the Gothic room opened as part of the museum. But its authority was not forgotten, if appreciated only in retrospect. Paul Bourget, the French writer, came to Boston in the 1890s. He was invited to see the portrait, and he wrote that its energy was at once delicate and invincible. He said that it reflected the force and that both inspired and also drove American commerce and industry. He saw it as a veritable Columbia, he said, and I quote, he saw this portrait as the deification of woman, as a supreme glory of the national spirit. Well, women were not the only people represented in Sargent's work who were subject to much attention and much criticism. And both Sargent's portrait of Graham Robertson, who you see on the left, and his Lord Ribblesdale on the right, attracted a lot of regard. Let's start with Robertson, who you see here on the left, and you see him in a double portrait, so a manipulated photograph that shows Robertson twice at center. Robertson was a painter, an illustrator, a writer, a collector. He designed the costumes for the 1892 production of Wilde's play Salome. This is an 1894 portrait, so just around the time that Robertson is close to Wilde. And this is the painting that gave the title to my lecture, because Sargent asked Robertson to pose, and he asked him to wear a long wool Chesterfield overcoat. It was August. Robertson was really hot, and he kept sort of hoping to get out of it. And Sargent said to him, "The coat is the picture. You must wear it." Not only did Robertson have to wear it, but Sargent wrapped it very, very tightly around Robertson, pulling it again, probably pinning it in the back. That gives him this amazing pencil-thin, long silhouette. A silhouette that was particularly associated with the aesthete, that gentleman of the late 19th century, who was considered artistic. And you see it at upper right in Boldini's portrait of Robert de Montesquieu, the French aesthete, or at lower right in a sort of cartoon caricature of James McNeill Whistler wearing a similarly tight overcoat. You see both of these gentlemen have walking sticks, and Robertson does too. So he is given a silhouette that was identified completely in the press with the artistic circles of London, and particularly the circles of Oscar Wilde, the pale, slender, fair-haired aesthete, perhaps akin to Dorian Gray, or as one writer put it when this painting was exhibited, he is the ideal dandy of this present year of grace. Well, it was shown in 1895. It was the year that Oscar Wilde was sentenced to hard labor for crimes of gross indecency, which you can see here on the May 1895 cover of Police News magazine. And you can see Wilde in the two circular images at sort of just under the banner headline. The fact that this was going on at the same time has made it all but impossible to really judge the tenor of critical commentary and the historical accounts. Sargent's portrait is subtle enough that you can't really tell whether it's admiration or satire. And Robertson himself disavowed his connection to Wilde and his circle, as many people did after that guilty verdict was announced. Robertson later claimed that that whole group around Wilde was such a crashing bore, his words, and that he saw very little of them, those dreary, clever young men of the Oscar period. Now, Lord Ribblesdale was born and raised in France. He was educated at Harrow. He was an army man. He was the son of a profligate aristocratic gambler who ran the entire estate into debt and then killed himself. And Lister succeeded to become the 4th Baron Ribblesdale, assuming his seat in the House of Lords in 1877 and promptly marrying the daughter of a rich industrialist so that his family went back on its proper path. He's shown in Sargent's portrait on the left, dressed for riding with a crop in his hand and a top hat, but it's not at all conventional riding, a conventional riding ensemble. It's not a habit. It is something that Ribblesdale was known for assembling and collecting and confecting his own look. So he chose the chamois pants, the long coat, which, by the way, is the same kind of coat that Robertson has, but it's not pinned and twisted around him. And he was known for his highly personalized appearances. He always chose his own outfit, his daughter recalled, and she added that her father possessed so strong a feeling for form in all things, in literature, in art, in dress, and in manners. So he cultivated this sort of elegant simplicity, deliberately picturesque and deliberately old-fashioned, and I'm just showing you a book that was published around the time this portrait was made, a couple years later, about the great fashionable man of the early 19th century, Beau Brummel. And I think you can see the illustrator's vision of Beau Brummel isn't that different, really, from the way that Ribblesdale appears in his portrait. Ribblesdale looks as if he stepped from the pages of one of these Regency novels. I failed to mention, I'm also showing you a photograph of him at lower right and a Spy magazine view of his tailored appearance at lower right. He's posed against classical pilasters in Sargent's portrait, which actually are features of Sargent's own studio. And the London Times said he looks old-fashioned, aware of his patrician position, but at the same time distinctly aware of his power. This is sort of the reincarnated dandy of the early 19th century, sober, subdued, elegant, interested in clothes, but not going as far as being, shall we say, artistic. But this dandyism was also ridiculed in the press when a cartoon of it appeared in Punch, where Ribblesdale's black silk tie and buff breeches ballooned to enormous proportions. Regrets, or why did I speculate in this net? Speculate in the neck, in such a necktie. Sorry. Sargent captured Ribblesdale, though, so completely, and we know this because when he went to see his painting at the Salon in 1904, he was recognized as the model for that particular painting and discussed in hushed whispers as a character from Central Casting. Ce grand diable de milord anglais, that great devil of the English milordy. Sargent's American sitters seem to have disregarded this way of being presented. They liked Sargent's modernity, but they, by and large, seemed to avoid his more theatrical tendencies, and instead they preferred more conventional masculinity. And I'm showing you here Henry Higginson on the left, 1903, and on the right, John D. Rockefeller from 1917. Just looking at Higginson's portrait, you can see it's imbued with a golden Rembrandt-esque light. He's owning that chair. You wouldn't want to sit next to him on the subway. His arm hooked behind him, taking up a lot of room. It's a pose that comes straight out of Hals and Rembrandt and Dutch painting. He's wearing a sober three-piece business suit. He was a banker. He is also shown as a man of service, because what's lying in his lap is his cavalry cloak from his service in the Massachusetts Cavalry in the Union Army during the Civil War, where he also acquired the scar that is featured in a highlight on his cheek. This painting was commissioned by Harvard for the new Harvard Union building, which Higginson helped to fund. You may know him better as the founder of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. But what a lesson for the men of Harvard, skilled at business, unassuming, a man of service, a man of stature. Rockefeller, I find amusingly, doesn't deal with much of this. He's wearing a simple blue serge jacket, dressed in white flannel pants, sitting in a simple Windsor chair. He doesn't need to show you power, because once you find out that it's John D. Rockefeller, you know that he's richer than you. So some of these masculine attributes show up in Sargent's portraits of women, giving them an authority that they wouldn't have if they were wearing pink satin and white lace. I'm showing you on the right Jane Evans from 1898, one of the few women to ever hold a position of authority at Eton College in the UK, that prestigious boys' boarding school, the one where Prince Harry went and got into trouble. If he had had Jane Evans as his house leader, he might not have. She was much loved, very strict, and you can see that Sargent paints her in the woman's equivalent of man's attire. It's a woman's black wool suit. She's given a pose that is often seen in portraits of men, and she feels like a sympathetic but also authoritative figure that comes from this adoption of masculine attributes. Well, sometimes masculine attributes really just signify a woman's true self, and this is a portrait of one of Sargent's childhood friends named Violet Paget. Violet Paget wrote under the pen name Vernon Lee, who, as many women did, writing under a male name in order to have more luck getting published. You see two photographs of Lee on the right. She adopted more masculine clothing, dark clothes, a stand-up male collar, a very severe hair cut. She wore her spectacles, and it really reflects who she was. Vernon Lee lived in lesbian relationships throughout her life. So these are public performances, things that tell you a lot about who people are. Sargent also portrayed actual performers like Carmencita, who was a much admired sexy Spanish dancer in the 1890s. You can see her twirling in the two old photographs on the right. You can also see her twirling in Thomas Edison's film of her on the MFA's mobile guide. It's also on YouTube. I'm not supposed to tell you that. And we also have her dress. And all of the action of Carmencita's performances are contained within the flickering brushstrokes of Sargent's rendition of her costume. He also showed actresses like Ellen Terry, here shown in a position that never happened during the performance of Macbeth that Sargent saw in 1888. He begged to paint Ellen Terry. She wouldn't let him until she knew that the play wasn't going to be a flop. And then he painted her in the most spectacular of her costumes, the beetle wing dress designed by the aesthetic movement designer Alice Cummins Carr. And we do have that spectacular costume near the painting. It's been the first time that Sargent's painting and the costume have been together since the painting was made in 1889. I'm also showing you one of Sargent's other ideas for the portrait, which he rejected at the top center, and a photograph of Ellen Terry wearing that dress. It was Edward Burne-Jones, the great pre-Raphaelite British painter, who came to Sargent's studio and said, I think this painting needs a little more blue. That might be why it doesn't exactly seem to match the costume, which looks much more green. But if anybody knows what the costume would have looked like under the conditions of limelight as opposed to gallery lighting, please let me know. And then there are issues of dressing up, something we've all thought about since yesterday was Halloween. This is Sargent's friend and the daughter of a London art dealer, Ina Wertheimer. The painting is called A Vele Gonfie, or In Full Sail. She burst into Sargent's studio one day. He was captivated by her energy, and he made her look like one of the three musketeers, here with something sticking out from underneath that piece of fabric that looks like a cloak. It looks like a sword, but it's a broomstick, and clearly they were having fun. But dressing up in costume can also reflect your social position, as it does in Charles Stuart, the Marquis of Londonderry, in full panoply as he appeared at the coronation of Edward VII, or on the right, tropical whites, decorations worn by Frank Swettenham, who was the Governor General of Malaysia. And he's grabbing onto a big length of Malaysian brocade. If this is not a portrait of empire, I don't know what is. Another way of sort of linking yourself to important things is if you link yourself to the history of art, as Mrs. Carl Meyer did in this portrait with its composition and her tiny little feet, based on a famous portrait by Boucher of Madame de Pompadour. So, to be a success as a portraitist, you must enter the public arena. And Sargent was certainly skilled at presenting his work to an audience and to garnering public and critical attention. At the same time, I think his paintings provided a convenient shield for their maker, who was never comfortable being the center of attention. And this dance between public and private, between display and reticence, between theatricality and privacy, I think are at the heart of Sargent's art. It's Sargent's work that took the stage, not the man. In about 1907, more or less, he did something that few people have the bravery to do. He gave up painting portraits. He gave them up unless he couldn't get out of the commission or it was of a friend. And after he stopped making those formal portraits, he did continue to paint family and friends, wearing clothes in casual settings, draped in shawls, or wearing white, voluminous skirts. Late in his career, Sargent left fashion behind, concentrating instead, I think, on the essence of his materials. He luxuriated in the abundance of both fabric and of sheer paint, transforming garments into imaginary landscapes made from whole cloth. This painting isn't a portrait. The subject is his niece Rosemary, twice, but it really functions as a landscape arranged by Sargent, a snowy field of white cloth animated by rivers of cashmere shawls. Fabric is now his main subject, taking up 3/4 of this composition. And critics compared this image to a flowing mountain stream, or as one particularly brilliant writer said, it's the liquefaction of clothes. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions. I can't see anybody yet, but I'm sure they'll turn that spotlight off me.
Hold on one second. I'm making my way to you in the center there. Just.
Please wait for the microphone. I know that will help anybody who is listening online. And I'm not offended if you want to just run down and use your ticket for the exhibition, because I know that's what you're all going to do next, right?
All right. Microphone is coming down your way here.
I've always loved both the people in his portraits as well as the fabric and so forth. But did any of his subjects ever get upset because he portrayed the fabric more beautifully or more handsomely than he did their faces?
Well, Sargent said on more than one occasion that he felt that portraiture was a kind of painting where something was wrong with the mouth. So people always sort of hung over his shoulder and said, I don't think I look like that. Most people came to be happy with their portraits, but I do know of one example, and I'm not going to remember the name of the sitter right now, but the husband complained and said that Sargent gave her a hairdo she never had, that her hair was a different color, she never owned that dress. So no, they didn't like theirs. They paid for it, though. Think about it. I mean, I know when I am photographed or I see myself on camera, I absolutely hate it. So I'm not sure that the person being depicted is actually the best judge.
Did Sargent have an agent, or how did these commissions come to pass? And then all the commissions, are they, because you would say this is currently in Iowa and this one is currently at the Met, are all of them accounted for?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of your question. I heard about, did he have an agent?
Did he have an agent? And then all of the portraits that he did, is there a public inventory of all of them?
So, very good question. It gives me a chance to do a shout out to my friends Richard Ormond and Elaine Kilmurray, both of whom have become good friends over the course of my career. Richard is Sargent's great nephew, and he and Elaine compiled a multi-volume catalogue raisonné of Sargent's work. The first 3 volumes are portraits, and then they're landscapes and figure paintings. Richard is now embarked on cataloging all of Sargent's charcoal drawings, sitter by sitter. So those are wonderful resources. We do have them in the library if I haven't checked them out. And they live on my desk, I'm afraid. And there are in later volumes some addenda. So the thing is, Richard had access to the beginnings of a catalogue raisonné that were made actually by David McKibben at the Boston Athenaeum when a lot of the sitters were still alive. So even if we don't know where the portrait is, we know that it existed, and those are also included in the catalogue raisonné. Sargent was remarkable in that he did not have an agent. He had a valet who helped him, move things around and, keep things moving. But I was astonished when I did the watercolor show to find out how deep in he was involved with shipping and framing, and he did a lot of this himself. He didn't have a big studio with assistants, and a lot of, they're both commissioned portraits, and then they're portraits that Sargent went after a sitter who he was particularly engaged with. And some of the ones that Sargent solicited are some of his best work. Madame Gautreau, Dr. Pozzi. These are solicited portraits. But Mrs. Hamersley is a commission, and she's pretty great. So it varied, but a lot of people found him to the point where he couldn't stand doing it anymore. aisle here and sort of a third of the way in.
Why don't we make our way, we'll start on this side and we'll make our way over.
Okay. I was at a wedding at the Brandegie Estate in Brookline, and they have a beautiful Sargent portrait there. I think it was Mrs. Brandegie, and I just wondered, did they ever lend it to the museum? Because people should, yeah, well, that's, okay.
The Brandegie portrait is beautiful, and you know, a lot of these things are still in families. They're treasured heirlooms. That is one of them. It's in its original family setting, and I have seen it, but it has not been on loan here. You have somebody on the aisle, yeah.
So how would you characterize Sargent's attitude in his portrait of Teddy Roosevelt? What was-
Oh gosh, I so wanted to borrow the Teddy Roosevelt portrait. So Teddy Roosevelt is, I'm going to come out from the podium, I'm sorry. Just for a moment, I will be vocal. So he stands quite firmly, one hand on his hip, the other hand holding a newel post, a round newel post that is almost like he's grabbing the globe. It's a fabulous portrait. It belongs to the White House, and the White House only lends within the confines of the District of Columbia. I tried. I think it's a great portrait because I love the forcefulness of it and the sort of implication of that grasp. Do you have a quick follow-up?
I just heard that Roosevelt was not, I heard that Roosevelt wasn't satisfied with his original presidential portrait. So
He was a tough customer, Teddy Roosevelt. Yeah.
Yes. Just as Sargent used fashion for his sitters to enhance and reveal their inner self and their personality, when I look at Sargent's self-portraits, it's quite the opposite. It's like his armor to hide that and to remove himself from being an aesthete. Would part of that be to keep his private life private because it might damage his reputation and then his career? Or is he just innately a very private person?
It's such a good question. I showed you all those portraits of Sargent deliberately because you can't get anything out of them in terms of his own personality. He was quite self-effacing for somebody who was out in public all the time. He was somebody who was not comfortable speaking in public. He doesn't keep journals, or if he, we don't know that he ever did, but they certainly don't survive. He didn't keep account books. So what we know of him often comes through other people who saved his letters or wrote of their memories of Sargent. He was very, very private. It's generally felt that Sargent was gay, and he certainly interacts with homosocial circles in both Paris and in London, but I don't think that it's really about his thinking through what effect that might have on his career. I really don't think so, because he's just so private in every other aspect of his personality. I think where you see it is in a great number of his portraits and figure studies of men.
We have our last question over on the other side.
Yes, what did he charge for these commissions, and did he work on more than one at a time, and how long would they take to complete?
All good questions. The answer vary. They could cost sort of around $10,000 in today's, in that time's money. The prices vary over time, and it also depends on the size of individual portraits. So obviously, Lord Londonderry is a giant thing, and it cost more than something the scale of Vernon Lee. So it depends whether you want just a bust-length portrait, a three-quarter-length portrait, a full-length portrait, and et cetera. So the prices do vary. The length of time of the sittings also varies. Lady Agnew was done in an amazing 6 sittings, really quick. The sketch of Vernon Lee was supposedly done in an hour. Marie Pailleron, she of the double portrait that won the prize, she looks, the little girl in the white dress with her brother, she complained that it took 80 sittings. Whether she was lying, I don't know. But it also depended very much on, like, could you sit for 15 minutes or could you stay for a morning, you know? So the numbers of sittings also vary. So that was a complete non-answer to your very smart question. Thank you so much for coming.